Good evening and welcome from the southern Oregon coast to the James and Randall show. I'm Randall, and on the line with me as always is my colleague and good friend from the great state of Oklahoma, James. James, what are we going to talk about tonight?
Hey Randall, it's good to be on with you. You know, one of the mysteries in life and there are so many, one of the mysterious wonders of the world are things like gnomes and fairies and little people. I thought that's something we might dive into a little bit tonight and discuss some of these things that people call by various names around the world.
Yeah, that's a really interesting subject. You know, I was doing some research on that, and many people have seen these small creature-like gnomes. They've seen elves, they call them demon elves. They've seen leprechauns, many things, but they all pretty much describe them in the same clothing, in the same attire. It's just really interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting subject, and there's a lot of discussion about this among Native American people. And being in Oklahoma, we have a huge Native American population here, and I'm right in the heart of the Comanche Nation, and they have their own stories about the little people, and they call them Nunapis, and they always describe them as little Native American people that live next to creeks and rivers and in the forest, but they call them little tricksters. They try to trick children into following them deep in the woods, and then they capture children. And this is something I've always wondered was just a tale that was passed down to keep kids from wandering off or getting too far from home, or is there some truth in this?
Well, that's kind of what I'm wondering. Now, with the Native Americans, is there any relationship between gnomes and Native Americans as far as them guarding their people, or maybe like fairies? I know that they kind of watch over people.
Well, I'm not familiar with a lot of the other Native stories on this particular subject, but the Comanches, they really believe that these creatures or these little people, are what they would say would have medicine or supernatural powers. When Native American refers to medicine, they're usually talking about supernatural powers, and they believe these little people have supernatural powers. And some of the other tribes believe that all the little stone arrow points that are found that are miscommonly called bird points, which are a little small arrow point, a projectile that goes on an arrow, were made by these little people. So, many tribes have a belief in this, some sort of a small person, or, in European culture it would be a leprechaun or a gnome. But we find this all over the world, and I just find that very fascinating. And behind all myth, there's got to be some truth. That's always said, behind every myth or legend, there is some truth.
Well, I agree with that. Around the world, people have gnomes in their gardens, and they say they're there to make the gardens grow. They actually use them. They put them in different places in the garden, and they actually supposedly help the flowers and the plants grow. Is there any truth to that?
I don't know, and I think in different cultures, sometimes they represent, maybe orneriness, or kind of like a trickster or something like that. And others, they guard treasure, like the fabled leprechaun. And others are just guardians of the forest. Some of them live in caves, some of them live under the water. They live in the mountains, and it's just funny how much this particular subject pops up in culture all over the world. And this is something I really want to ask our listeners to really, chime in about and talk to us about, and give us some, emails, give us some feedback on this subject.
Well, I agree with you. They also say that gnomes, not only for being in gardens and things of that nature, but people who experience seeing a gnome or experience the behavior usually are people who are under some kind of duress or some stress, or are in an unfamiliar area.
Right. like with spirits or Bigfoot, or it's just one of these things that we don't know enough about. And I'm going to share a story real quick that was told to me about 10 years ago from a tribal police officer. I was visiting with him one evening, and we got to speaking about little people and things in the forest. And he told me one evening that he got a call to the local bingo hall. And the bingo hall was kind of out in the country, kind of secluded. It was a big metal building, almost like a metal barn. There was a creek, not too far behind, surrounded by trees. This was a real rural bingo hall on tribal land. And he told me he got a call one night from the surveillance there at the bingo hall and said, "We have 7 kids out here vandalizing a car in the parking lot. They're jumping up and down on the car and vandalizing the car." So the tribal police officer went to the bingo hall, and when he pulled in the drive, he shined the spotlight, and he saw 7 young kids, or what he thought was 7 young kids, jumping up and down on a car, on a 4-door sedan. So when he pulled up there and got close enough, he said they jumped off the car, they all saw him. He knew immediately they weren't children, and they took off to the woods. And I asked the officer, I said, "Well, what were they?" He said, "They were the little people of legend." He said, "I actually saw them." He said, "I always heard stories like that from my grandmother and my grandfather, and never believed in it, but I saw with my own eyes. They jumped off the car and ran right toward the woods." And I asked him, "Well, what do they look like, and how were they dressed?" And he said, "I don't even remember." He said, I was just so taken back by the moment." He said, "I didn't chase them. I just kind of froze." He said, all I could do was look on. And I spoke with him not too long ago, and I always bring that up, and he said, "I've never seen another one to this day, but I did see 7 on that night." So I find that very interesting, because people like police officers or firefighters or anybody in that field, they're really trained to what they see and to take notes, and they're very credible people.
Well, I agree with you 100%. And, coming from a tribal officer, a law enforcement officer, really, he has nothing to gain by telling the story that he told you. And yeah, he probably did see something out there. It's really too bad that at that point he couldn't describe them. And that's one of the things that when you're shocked into something, seeing something like that, you don't really think about a description right away. All you can think about is you're in awe of what you've seen.
That's correct. That's like, hunters who will be, when they're out in the woods and they're hunting with rifles and they see Bigfoot and they can see him in the sights of their gun, and people say, "Why didn't you shoot it?" Well, they get caught up in the moment. I wouldn't shoot one myself, but there's a lot of people that say, "Well, if I saw one, I would shoot it." But there's so many people that have spotted those creatures, and when they see them, they're just, I don't know if something just overwhelms them or comes over them, but if you listen to the interviews, anytime something of that nature is seen, people just really, I don't know if they're in shock or what, but they just freeze up.
Well, people react differently in different situations. And when you see something like that, the last thing that's on your mind is to do harm to that creature or whatever you see. The first thing that's on your mind is, am I really seeing what I'm seeing? And that's one of the things that people don't understand, is that you're always going to react differently in certain situations.
Right. People will say, "Well, I would do this and I would do that," and until you're in that situation, you don't know what you're going to do. There's a famous show that's on television that goes out and looks for ghosts and things like that. And a few years ago, they did a special over in either Ireland or England or somewhere, where they were looking for these little creatures. And they caught some interesting things, some heat signatures on their infrared camera. Little figures that were just maybe 2 feet off the ground, walking on 2 legs. I think these things are out there. I think they're rarer than like Bigfoot or anything else, that's out there in this field. And, I'd like to see some more research done on this. I'd like to see some more people going out and investigating these things.
Well, I would too. And real quick, because we don't have a lot of time, I want to share a story with our listeners out there right now. There was a young lady named Lynn, and her mother, who actually moved to Puerto Rico, and I guess they were just out trying to start a new life, and they moved into an old house that her mother bought, and she came home from school one day early, and there wasn't anybody home, and they were in this new house that her mother had purchased, and she went to take a shower. But when she got into the shower, she heard her dog barking profusely. He just wouldn't quit. So she quickly jumped out of the shower, went outside, and saw what he was barking at. And it was a very short creature, about 2 feet tall, and it had a pointed hat and pointed shoes. And she yelled for the dog, "Come on, come on, come on." And so when her mother got home, she told her mother the story, and her mother said, "Yeah, right." And she goes, "No, I will prove it to you." So a couple of days later, she yelled outside, "Hey, what is your name?" Because she saw him again out her window. The creature smiled at her. And the creature yelled back, "My name is Polazar." And so she told her mother that, and her mother said, "No way, this cannot be true." And so at 1 o'clock that very morning, her mother saw the same thing. And she said, "You cannot tell anybody. And not only that, we are leaving this house." And they actually left that house because strange things were happening.
Well, and I wonder if that could play back into spirits and demons and different things like that. This is a subject that we could talk about on many episodes. And I would sure like to get some feedback from any of our listeners. And, we'll read them on our next show. And Randall, give us the email again for everybody to listen if they want to give us an email.
Oh, I sure will, James. Our email address is jamesrandalltalk@gmail.com. One more time, that's jamesrandalltalk@gmail.com. Folks, don't be afraid to come out of the woodwork. Let us know what you're feeling. Let us know what you're thinking. If you have any experiences, be it paranormal, be it scientific, if you've seen a gnome, if you've seen a fairy, if anything, just let us know, and we'll try to get you on the show also.
Yeah, that's great. And also, Randall, I'd like to just end the show with saying that our thoughts and prayers are with all those families that lost those children, and it's a shame that things like that have to happen, and our deepest sympathy to those families.
Oh, thank you very much, my friend. And yes, we'd like to offer our condolences to the families and all the friends or relatives who lost young children, and some of the adults in that shooting that happened in Connecticut. And we're with you 100%. And I think all of America is with you. In fact, all of the world is with you.
Amen to that, Randall. Amen to that.
Well, we're going to go ahead and close this out, and I'd like to say good night from the Southern Oregon coast.
And good night from Oklahoma, and we hope to hear from you. Send us an email.
That sounds good. And good night to you, my friend. And this is it for the James and Randall Show. Good night.